Welcome back to the Fourth Way Podcast. Roland Allen's The Spontaneous Expansion of the Church. Chapter 8. Ecclesiastical Organization. In this chapter, I examine the relation between our missionary organization and our church organization, and the relation of both to the establishment of native churches. I then examine at length the method by which we attempt to train men to hold the higher offices in our church organization, contrasting it with the simplicity and directness of the apostolic method. As protagonist on the one side, I bring forward Bishop King, on the other, Friar Herbert Kelly, and I close with the judgment of an adversary of all Christian church expansion. I said at the beginning of my last chapter that we have two organizations for missionary work, one modern, the Missionary Society, and the other ancient, the Church. But when we consider the organization of the Church today as an organization for missionary work, we must not expect to find it unimpaired in its original purity. In the beginning, the Church was a missionary society. It added to its numbers mainly by the life and speech of its members, attracting to it those who were outside. Where they went, churches were organized. Where they settled, men who had never heard of the Church saw the Church, and, being attracted by the life, or by the speech of its members, learned its secret, joined it, and were welcomed into it. Today, members of the Church are scattered all over the world, but they do not carry the Church with them in their own persons. They were not organized. They very often do not desire the conversion of those among whom they live. They do not welcome them into the Church. So societies are formed to do this for them. The Church, as a church, is not a missionary society enlarging its borders by multiplying local churches. So, societies are formed within it to do its work for it. Obviously, they cannot do it properly. We may compare the relation of the societies to the Church with the institution of divorce in relation to marriage. Just as divorce was permitted for the hardness of men's hearts because they were unable to observe the divine institution of marriage in its original perfection, so the organization of missionary societies was permitted for the hardness of our hearts because we had lost the power to appreciate and to use the divine organization of the Church in its simplicity for the purpose for which it was first created. And just as men could never have recovered the divine perfection of the first institution simply by making divorce illegal, because the perfection of the divine institution did not depend on the legality or illegality of divorce, but upon a divine conception of the relationship of human beings one with another. So the divine perfection of the Church as a missionary society cannot be recovered simply by abolishing the missionary societies and saying, "Let the Church be her own missionary society. That is enough." We often hear men say that and talk as if that would suffice. We see it practiced, and the result is not the organization of the groups of churchmen all over the world as churches, but the creation of a board of missions for the Church, which is nothing more than a department of church organization, and is, in its spiritual character, almost identical with a missionary society within the Church. Just as the divine perfection of the institution of marriage could only be recovered by such an understanding of the divine will for men, and such a union of human beings and God as would make the suggestion of divorce monstrous, and a law permitting it ridiculous, so the missionary perfection of the Church can only be recovered by such an apprehension of the divine purpose of her creation, and such an understanding of her organization as essentially missionary that the suggestion of the creation of a missionary society, or of a department within her for the prosecution of missionary work, would appear ridiculous to the point of absurdity. Divorce was permitted because men's conception of marriage and their use of it were far from that which was in the beginning. Missionary societies and missionary boards are permitted because men's conception of the Church and their use of her organization are far removed from that which was in the beginning. Nevertheless, though divorce was allowed for the hardness of men's hearts, still the divine perfection of the first institution was man's proper heritage, and is to be recovered in Christ. And so the divine institution of the Christian Church as a missionary society is the proper heritage of churchmen, and we may yet recover it. But at the moment we must confess that we have it not. We should see it restored tomorrow in the mission field, if only we would establish churches there today. In my last chapter, I pointed out that the modern missionary societies began their work not by recalling the church to the reality of her own character, but by attempting to do her missionary work for her. Consequently, in this attempt, they naturally organized their work in their own way. They established mission stations and created a host of lay agents, catechists and teachers and evangelists, to preach in the villages round the stations, to teach inquirers and converts, and to lead the congregations. These were at first all paid agents of the missionary society, and they were trained under the direction of missionaries in mission schools, and worked under the direction of missionary superintendents, or of councils which the missionaries created and controlled. There was thus in the mission field an organization of the Christians under the societies, which could be easily distinguished from the church. But the societies proclaimed that they sent out their agents as representing the church, and they desired to found native churches in the countries to which they went. This they could not do. Only a church could propagate itself and beget churches. The societies realized that their agents could not ordain native clergy. They could only create orders of lay workers. A bishop was necessary for the establishment of a church. They appealed, therefore, for missionary bishops, and slowly and hesitatingly, bishops were appointed to organize churches in the mission field. The conception of the church, held both by the episcopacy at home and by the leaders of the societies, was identical. They were far removed from the apostolic church. The only church organization with which they were familiar was the organization of a national church in a country which had for centuries been nominally Christian. They thought of bishops as great officials governing and directing, more or less, large numbers of clergy, most of whom they scarcely knew by sight, in dioceses so large they could not possibly visit the parishes except at rare intervals. They thought of parish priests as officials of the church, who ruled almost autocratically in their parishes, responsible not at all to the laity for their conduct, and only partially to their bishops. They thought of the laity not so much as members of the church as people whose duty it was to obey the church as represented by her bishops and priests. The apostolic conception of the bishop as the father of a spiritual family, as the pastor of a flock, every member of which he should know by name, was lost. Men still used the titles, chief pastor and father in God, but they did not expect him to know his family or his flock, personally and intimately. Both bishop and priest were officials, and paid officials, separated widely from the laity by training and by conventional manners and customs. It was the organization of this stationary national church which we attempted to apply to the mission field. By dint of diligent and persevering collection, sufficient money was secured to endow bishoprics with a stipend which the authorities considered adequate, and bishoprics were established. Some huge portion of the earth's surface was marked off in which a mission or missions existed, and that was called a diocese. So a bishop was given 6 provinces of China as a diocese, when he was the leader of a band of half a dozen missionaries with 2 or 3 mission stations in 2 of the provinces. A country the size of Germany was thought a proper diocese for a single bishop. The head missionary at a mission station was similarly called a parish priest, and he called a mission district the size of Wales or Yorkshire his parish, though he had not, and probably never would, set foot in large parts of it. Obviously, this church organization corresponded sufficiently well to the missionary organization. The bishop appointed was generally a missionary, or heartily in sympathy with the work of the societies, and the societies generally subscribed a considerable part of the endowment of the see. He knew as much of the work done by his clergy in his diocese as most of the English bishops knew of theirs. The superintending missionaries in idea corresponded sufficiently closely to the parish priests at home, and the other clergy, native or foreign, to curates at home. The district was looked upon as a parish. The church buildings of the little congregations in it corresponded more or less to church buildings in parishes in England. The fact that an organization in which the parish priest lived within a few miles of his most distant parishioners was being applied to an area in which he was removed from the majority of them by a journey of days or weeks was overlooked. The system nominally applied. There was a bishop, there were priests, there was a laity. What more could anyone ask? If we imagine St. Paul being solemnly appointed Bishop of Europe, or St. Mark as parish priest of Galatia, If we think of St. Mark traveling up and down 70 miles round Antioch and Pisidia to administer the sacraments, and of the churches of Italy and Greece dependent for confirmations upon St. Paul, if we think of St. Paul sending urgent appeals to Antioch for a priest for Rome or Corinth, as we appeal for Benares or Peking, we see at once the difference between the apostolic organization of the Church and the organization which we exported from England. The bishops, then, sent from England, established this type of church organization, but the organization of the native Christians under the missionary societies in many parts of the world did not therefore cease. One society might proclaim itself the mere handmaid of the Church and desire that all its work should be directed by the bishop, but another might claim to direct its own missionary operations in its own way. Where this was the case, difficulties inevitably arose, for there were, in fact, two ecclesiastical organizations in the same place. Very early, the bishop began to argue that the evangelization of the country was the duty of the Church in the country, and as representing the Church, he claimed to direct the missionary policy of the societies. I have myself heard bishops complain that a society allowed and encouraged its agents to establish stations and places within his diocese, so far distant that he could not possibly supervise their work. This was the inevitable result of our church organization, which created vast dioceses in which a bishop was lost, instead of creating bishops wherever there were Christians to form a church. Instead of rejoicing that a new church was springing into existence in a far distant part of the country, the bishop was reduced to complaining of such misfortune. This action, however unhappy, brought into sharp relief the fact that the mission was not the church. There was a certain rivalry between the bishop as representing church organization and the secretaries of societies as representing the society organization. The delegates sent out to India by the CMS in 1921 recognized what a serious difficulty this was. They said, "The outstanding fact in our present CMS administration is that in the great majority of the dioceses it is quite outside diocesan control. It is impossible for such an organization to be other than a divisive influence in the diocese, for as the inevitable result there are two authorities, on the one hand the bishop and his office and his councils, on the other hand the CMS secretary and his office and his committees, and the more strong and efficient the CMS secretary, his office, and his committees, the more divisive will be their influence. It will be obvious that when the dioceses are controlled by Indian bishops, as in many cases they will be with the coming extension of the episcopate, the cleavage indicated and the antagonism resulting will be even more apparent." One very prominent feature of missionary organization was the establishment of committees of missionaries in which questions of policy and finance were considered, and when the missionaries began to talk of the establishment of a native church, they naturally thought first of councils. It was largely by their action that the church councils for districts or larger areas were established, and these councils were recognized as part of the diocesan organization, that is, of the church organization as opposed to the missionary organization. These councils were certainly a great advance on the pure autocracy of foreign missionaries, but they still further misled the native Christians as to the true character of church organization. As I have already pointed out, the great multitude of the converts lived in congregations which were not churches. When church councils were put into the prominent place while the fundamental simplicities were neglected, they did not find the church which they joined a little family in the town or village, guided by a father, a bishop who knew every one of them intimately, a family in which all were mutually responsible for the well-being of the whole. They did not find it at a school in which all together were learning to grow in grace under the guidance of their most experienced and respected elders. They learned that it was a strange form of government in which they might elect a representative to attend a council to do something which they did not understand, generally with the result that they were asked to increase their contributions. While far away there was an exalted ruler called a bishop, from whom they might occasionally receive a visit. That the conception of church organization, which the native Christians have learned, is the conception of an arrangement of councils to control the finances and policy of a body consisting of a multitude of congregations, which are not churches, only makes confusion worse confounded. Over these church councils the missionaries had at first, and still have generally, complete control. And though, as I have said, these councils were not really part of the missionary organization, little friction arose. But as intellectual education spread among the native Christians, they began to appreciate the powers of a council in finance and administration, and they naturally fixed upon the council as the important element in church organization, and saw that if they could dominate the church councils, they could gain control over the affairs of the district, or of the whole diocese. Nay, more, just as in early days bishops had claimed, as representing the church, to control the policy of missionary societies, so now, in the more advanced areas, the native Christians in councils as representing the church inevitably claim the right to control the policy and finances of the foreign missionary societies working in their country. Hence has arisen the struggle, which we now see going on between the church, as represented by the more intellectual and wealthy Christians, and the mission. It is essentially a struggle first to free the church from missionary control, and then to control the mission by subordinating it to the church as represented by the church councils. Today, the question which absorbs almost more attention than the conversation or conversion of the heathen is the question of the relation of church and mission. How much authority the mission must resign, how much it can safely retain in its own hands. The CMS delegates to India did not conceal their anxiety. It is not too much to say that unless some definite steps are taken to withdraw the control which the society still exercises over the congregations and churches, there will be dangerous embitterment and probably schisms in various places. This is true not only of India, but of many other parts of the mission field, and it will be soon true of all, for everywhere like causes will sooner or later produce like results. The last stage of the controversy is at hand in India, where the CMS proposes to take in hand forthwith the transfer of the whole of its work from the society to the diocese, with their significant reservations. It is inherent in the situation that the supporters of a society in the West must believe in its work if they are to continue their support. Inevitably, grants must cease if their sympathy is forfeited, and we propose that the diocesan bodies controlling the society's work should be constituted on an elective basis. This can be so arranged as to secure the inclusion of a due representation of the society's missionaries, and also of Indian representatives of those districts in which the society has been responsible for the instruction of the church for many years past. It is difficult to believe that any such scheme which needs such safeguards can be more than a mere palliative, an expedient which may or may not tide over a period of difficult transition. But the time cannot be very far distant when the native church, as represented by its bishops and its councils, will insist on being master in its own house, whatever may happen to grants made by a society in the West. But in many parts of the world, seeing the difficulties which two ecclesiastical organizations created, we made great efforts really to identify the mission and the church. We began by sending a bishop as head of the mission. There was, in theory, only one organization, and that church organization. But unfortunately, it was church organization of that type which I have already described. Like Nebuchadnezzar's image, its head was of gold, its belly of brass, and its feet part of iron, part of clay. It stood upon feet of iron and clay, paid lay workers in congregations which were not churches. Its head was high uplifted, one solitary potentate, the bishop, and between these was an utterly inadequate number of priests, quite unable to provide nourishment for the whole, but strong and exclusive as brass. Moreover, in practice, it was impossible to identify the mission with the church. Theoretically, the church and the mission were one, but it was impossible for most of the missionaries to identify themselves with the natives in the church. We habitually speak of the native church as something distinct from the mission. We habitually speak of the mission as something which is to pass, and the church as something which is to survive and remain when the mission is withdrawn. The native Christians also inevitably make a distinction between the mission and the church. The mission consists of missionaries assisted by a number of natives, whom they select and train to help them in their work. But they are essentially not of the country, and are liable to retire at any moment to a distant land when sickness or other calls make it desirable. We cannot but recognize that everywhere we have established missions, and missions are not churches. The early church sent out missionaries, but it established no missions. We establish a mission and give it a certain permanence, whilst yet we always speak of it as something passing. The consequence is that we get at once a confusion of thought and a conflict of action. The mission is to establish the church, but it establishes itself and exists over against the church. This is not biblical. It is not really a question, as we nearly always say, of times and circumstances, of race and age. It is a question of principle and spirit. If we establish missions instead of establishing churches, it is because we differ from the apostles and the early church in principle and in spirit. I do not want to labor this point. I only want to suggest that so profound a difference in action cannot be the effect of mere change of circumstances. Seeing then that over the whole mission field the native church can be distinguished from the mission in this respect, that everywhere the mission proclaims its passing character, and seeing that the mission can never cover the field, and that the work must be the work of the native church, we have everywhere set ourselves to prepare natives to take over those positions which the foreigners of the mission now occupy. And we have taught them to look forward to a day when the native church will be directed by its own priests and bishops. The problem of church and mission is really the same in character everywhere. When we turn to consider how we attempt to bring this to pass, obviously we shall find that our attempt is conformed to the conception of the church and her organization which is carried abroad with us. Everywhere the cry today is that the mission must train leaders for the native church to be. What this preparation is, I find expressed very clearly in an article in the East and West for April 1909. It was written by Bishop King, who was then bishop in Madagascar, and has since been General Secretary of the SPG. His paper represents the attitude of the official of the church on the mission field and the official of the society at home, and describes a training which is familiar to all who are acquainted with our work abroad, for it is training still followed everywhere almost universally. In this article, he distinguishes 5 steps in which the path by which a native ministry is to be reached. 1. The foreign missionary begins to fasten on a certain of his scholars and consciously to train them for future work. Why does he do this? Because he grows fond of his best pupils and tried to keep them near him. The majority of those whom he teaches are clearly incapable of receiving a good education. They are good fellows, but they are stupid. But there are some 3 or 4 pupils whose intelligence is of a higher order, and whom he hopes to educate and to use. In acting thus, he is naturally led to the only possible path of development in his work. He lays hold of the best elements of the race to which he ministers, and trains and wields them into a force which he can use. Now here we at once observe that the training is intellectual training, that the best elements of the race are said to be young scholars of higher intelligence than their fellows, that the object of the training is to create a force which the foreign missionary can use, and finally, that all the early training of the race in native government of their family or tribe is set wholly on one side as of no account. The training is given, essentially, education in the narrow, modern, Western sense of the word, a literary and intellectual training. The bishop says that this is the only possible path of development. It is not the only path. It is not even certain that it is the best path. That it is not the only possible path is proved by the history of the early church, which certainly did not follow this path, for it was led from the beginning by elders. That it is not necessarily the best path may be doubted from his own description of it. In a country where all affairs of importance are weighed and decided by the elders, it is gravely open to doubt whether it is wise to begin by setting the elder on one side and training the very young to be his assistants of the foreign missionary. It is a contradiction of all the deepest and strongest convictions of the people. It disassociates church order at the very foundation from their natural conceptions of order. That the church should begin by setting aside the elders in order to elevate the youngest to guide their elder is indeed to present to the people a conception of church order as something utterly strange and subversive of all natural order. But church order is not the enemy of the natural and instinctive, the almost universal conviction that the elders should guide the younger generation. If then it were true that this was the only possible path of development in the missionary's work, it would be at once apparent that the missionaries' work was work of a very strange and dangerous character, and wise men of experience, not only in Madagascar but in England, would look askance at it. A work which admits no possibility of development except upon the subversion of all natural order is indeed a work open to grave doubts. That the bishop wholly ignores the traditional training of the race for positions of authority also raises some doubt as to the wisdom of his plans, because that training has, in the experience of many ages, produced men in every race and tribe who naturally command the respect of their fellows. They are possessed of a large fund of traditional wisdom. They have been tried and tested again and again in questions of difficulty by their neighbors and kinsfolk and friends. They know their people, and are known by them with a profound intimacy. They know how to speak and how to maintain any customs which they hold of importance. As Christians, they surely should be the missionaries' chief supports. No, not at all, says Bishop King. The best elements of the race are young boys of quick wits. The one thing of importance is not experience or weight, but a sharp, intelligent mind which can quickly acquire new and strange information. To be able to learn arithmetic and geography and reading and writing, that is the ability which proves a boy to be worthy of place among the best elements of his race. I wonder if this is certainly true. I wonder whether the fact that a foreign missionary can easily educate a lad necessarily proves that the boy the best instrument for the propagation of the gospel or for the establishment of the church. But the training is to produce a force which the foreign missionary can use. Here is revealed the secret. This is the only possible way to produce a force which the foreign missionary can use. The work to be done is his work, and must be done in his way. Any instrument that he cannot use is useless. The grave elders of the village cannot easily be molded into a shape to fit his hand. They are no good. A child can be molded to fit his hand and to do exactly what he wants done. But is it good for the church? Number 2. The education of the first boys completed, they become a group of teachers or catechists. They can read the Bible, conduct prayer, give simple catechetic lessons, preach simple mission sermons. They will form a sort of a ring about him. Some will live near him and help in his central church and school. Others will settle in the villages round about and take services, build churches, work schools, and thus in due course the mission outstations are created, daughter churches to the central church where the missionary more especially works. This is the second stage of the work, when the alien missionary has formed a group of native workers depending more or less closely on himself. Here we must observe what Father Helbert Kelly calls the familiar absurdity of the lay reader. The man who may not celebrate because he is too uneducated and has not passed examinations is allowed to preach and minister to souls. We must notice also that the bishop speaks of outstations guided by these lay readers as daughter churches, as if a congregation without ministers, without sacraments, was a church. This is a theory of the church unknown to the Bible, unknown to early Christian history, unknown to any Catholic teaching. It is indeed the flat contradiction of them all. And finally, we are told that the group of native workers thus formed depends more or less closely on the alien missionary. Thus, the practical training of these men at this stage is training in familiarity with a church accustomed to regard the Lord's Supper as an occasional luxury, and in dependence on what Bishop King calls the alien missionary. Number 3. The third stage is the college. Some sort of college must be formed which will ensure a better education to new boys who give themselves to the work. All alike declare that they must have better trained men. In consequence, one missionary withdraws from pastoral and evangelistic work and concentrates his efforts upon a college. The best existing native workers are called in to help him, and a much more thorough and effective training lasting from 3 to 5 years is given to those who have passed through the local mission schools. A determined effort is made to develop the spiritual life and mental powers of a few selected native boys. These better trained men come out of college prepared to work as catechists of superior sort. Here we must observe that it is the need of the missionaries for men better trained in their system which creates the demand for the college. The theory of preparation supported by Bishop King is beginning to show its weakness. The catechists, half-trained at the earlier stage, have been put into an impossible position to guide congregations of men of larger experience than their own, by the light of a smattering of Western education and theology. They have been separated by their education from the people whom they are to teach. Too much responsibility for the conduct of the congregation has been thrown upon them. They have been half-trained in a purely Western and utterly strange manner of life. They do not know what to do. They want to please their master, the foreign missionary, to whom they are solely responsible. They want to do things as he would do them, but they do not know how, and no one in the village can help them. They are isolated, cut off from their own people by their education, cut off from the foreigner whom they serve by race and habits of thought. Their one chance is to live precisely by his directions, but when he gives directions, they very often cannot carry them out. For instance, he wants accounts kept, and they cannot keep them well in his way, and the way of their fathers is not known or not approved by him, even if they had learnt, or could now learn that way. So they get muddled, and this muddle enters into matters even more serious than accounts, and everybody is dissatisfied. The missionary naturally thinks that the fault lies in the lack of training. It never enters his head that he is beginning at the wrong end, and that he is putting the wrong man in the wrong place. The elders, if they were permitted, could manage all their local church affairs in their own way easily and successfully, but that would not suit the missionary's account book. And the work is his work, and must be done in his way. Consequently, he cries aloud for better trained men. And still the church is built on a lay foundation, with neither ministers nor sacraments, except as an occasional visit from the priest in charge of the district may permit. In all this training, the ideas of ministry is purely personal. Bishop King says that at this stage, we are still some way from an ordained ministry, that is, men whose character and piety we can sufficiently trust, and whose mind is adequately trained to allow us to present them for the gift of the holy orders. This idea that the gift of holy orders is a purely personal thing is very dangerous. It is the church which has a ministry, not only an individual. If we allow ourselves to think of it as purely individual and personal, we are in danger of falling, as we do fall, into serious mistakes. The minister exists, so to speak, apart from the church to which he ministers. He is given a charge, a cure of souls, a sphere of work, and so many souls are handed over to him. And thus the responsibility is all laid upon him, and the responsibility of the church is ignored. If ministers of Christ have a responsibility to him for the care of the church over which he has made them overseer, the church also has a responsibility for the ministers, for in truth, the ministry is given to the church, not the church to the ministry. In appointing ministers for congregation, it is as important to consider the needs of the church as it is to consider the character and education of the individual. But by looking solely at the individual, we forget the church. In the early church, we find local men ordained for the local church. They were ordained for that church, and they did not seek for some congenial sphere wherever they might see an opening or could obtain preferment. Thus, the link between the church and the ministry was maintained. But in our system, when the ministry is considered a purely personal gift, men seek for themselves, or are sent by authority, to occupy this post or that, without any regard to the link which is thus snapped, and the consequence is that they often look upon churches simply as places which offer them opportunities for the exercise of their gifts, or as steps in a ladder of preferment. But the link thus broken is not an unimportant one. In England, where the whole population moves from place to place with extreme ease and readiness, the evil is not so apparent. But in a country where generation after generation lives in the ancestral village, the link between the local church and its ministers is of great importance, and the importation of a stranger to act as minister to people whom he does not know intimately, and who do not know him and his whole family intimately, is a serious evil. At this point, the bishop goes out of his way to repeat a familiar argument by which we moderns contrive to repudiate the teaching of the Bible and the practice of St. Paul. He says that some non-episcopal missions have taken a perilous shortcut towards ecclesiastical completeness, which must be avoided at all costs. They have followed blindly that they conceived to be the practice of St. Paul and St. Barnabas. They have bidden each little group of Christian converts select a local man of good character. They have appointed him to administer holy baptism and the Lord's Supper in the congregation, which has chosen him. They have failed to understand that the first Christian churches were bits broken off the local synagogues, and that they were usually to be found among the earliest converts, men who had been well trained in the faith, the morals, and the devotional life of Judaism. He says that the system does not work so badly as might have been supposed, but when all allowances are made, he, the foreign missionary, feels sadly conscious that he has let the reins of power pass from his hands, can only advise and exhort where he ought to rule. This argument sounds curiously in the mouth of a Christian bishop. The apostolic practice was not peculiar to St. Paul and St. Barnabas, for it was followed over very wide areas long after the death of the apostles. There were great numbers of small churches in the apostolic and sub-apostolic age in Asia Minor, Armenia, North Africa, and elsewhere, which were certainly not bits broken off of the local synagogues, and the names of their first bishops are certainly not Jewish names. It is strange that a Christian bishop should ascribe the stability and growth of Christian churches more to the power of training in faith, the morals, and the devotional life of Judaism than to the power of the Holy Ghost and of the grace of Jesus Christ. What is less strange, but is very significant, is the bishop's strong emphasis on the duty of the missionary to rule, and his scorn of the weakness of exhortation and advice. He has rejected the practice of St. Paul, and with it, apparently the spirit of St. Paul, who certainly relied, as all his epistles proclaim, upon the power of exhortation and advice. He certainly did not maintain his power to rule by refusing ordination, and he certainly did not lose it by ordaining ministers. Number 4. The fourth stage in the preparation of a native ministry, says the bishop, can only come slowly. The clergy must be selected in due course out of the body of trained native catechists. Occasionally, and to meet an immediate need of a man of very partial training, who has done long service, and whose character has been well proved, may be selected. But as a rule, knowledge as well as character, education as well as godliness, are necessary in a ministry which is to command the respect of native churches. With regard to the appointment of clergy, he says, it should be clearly laid down that a church has no fight to expect to have clergy of its own race in sufficient numbers until it can pay for their maintenance. And he adds, it is gravely open to doubt if the clergy of any church can, as a whole, be trusted to put forth their best efforts if their success, or non-success, in no way affects their income. Here we must observe once more the emphasis upon intellectual training, and the ignoring of the training in government and management of practical affairs, which is derived from the direction of the family or the tribe, as well as of the spiritual authority and influence which is very often possessed in the highest degree by men whom the bishop certainly could not train to be catechists, and certainly would not ordain as clergy. And further, we cannot but notice that very strange emphasis on pay. Father Kelly has remarked that the poor are largely deprived of the sacraments because priests are so expensive. For generations after the death of the apostle, there were no paid clergy in the church. If St. Paul and his successors had followed the scheme of Bishop King, the church in Europe would have known neither bishops nor sacraments. Number 5. The last stage, the most difficult of all, is the development of a native episcopate. Is it sufficiently realized? The bishop asks that a native episcopate must be trained, that if a native bishop is to arise in a missionary church, the body of men, natives, from among whom he must rise must be created. It may be said that we may select the best of our own native parish priests. In that case, we must see to it that our native clergy are, some of them, in a full sense parish priests. At present, they are too often mere assistant curates to the English missionary, and are not developing self-dependence, administrative gifts, and power of government. Among other things, a bishop must be a governor, and to find a governor we must create a body of parish priests who are accustomed to govern. It is better that they should make mistakes in ruling than that they should never learn to rule at all. We must not set apart just one or two marked men as bearers of responsibility. We must create a whole class. But beyond all else, the idea is needed that a native episcopate ought to be. Ideas come first in order of time. They are realized in due season. The very idea that there can and ought to be such a thing is only now rising above our intellectual horizon, And until the idea of a native episcopate is made familiar to our clergy and laity in the mission field, we shall get no further towards creating it. In principle, we teach that God is no respecter of persons, and chooses whom he will as the recipients of his grace of orders. But in practice, we seem to be saying that, to our people, God wants you all to be Christians, some few of you to be priests, but he only chooses white men as bishops. Let us then foster the true idea that and the thing itself will come in due time. Here indeed is a remarkable thing. The whole of the preceding training has been training of the native workers in obedience to the missionary governor. At every stage, the natives have been under the direction of foreigners upon whom they have been taught and depend for guidance and support. At every stage, the supremacy of the alien missionary has been asserted. He has been told that he must rule. He has been practicing the art of ruling his native helpers. Now, all of a sudden, the foreigner is rebuked for ruling, and the demand is made that the natives should be trained in self-dependence and power and government, even at the cost of mistakes. The whole idea of the preparation is transformed. But as the bishop has discovered, that is not an easy change. Missionaries who have been encouraged to rule and direct native catechists and teachers naturally rule and direct native deacons and priests. A Christian community which has learned from the very beginning that their ministers depend upon the foreigner for support and guidance are not prepared to support native priests. The boys who have been educated in mission schools and colleges under the government of foreigners have learned from the very beginning to rely upon their foreign director. In a moment, all this is to be changed. They must learn to act for themselves and to exercise responsibility without any support. The foreign bishop in his action can rely upon the support of the missionaries. The missionaries in taking action can rely upon the support of the bishop and their fellow missionaries. Upon whose support can a self-dependent native priest rely? He cannot rely upon his own people, because they have not learned to expect any serf-dependent action on the part of natives in the church. He cannot rely upon the support of the foreign missionaries, unless he does precisely what they do, as they do it. He cannot rely upon the support of the foreign bishop, unless the bishop happens to approve of his action, and that is not certain if the native priest really acts for himself. Serf-dependence in his case means an isolated self-dependence, a dangerous self-dependence. He is a paid official, generally with a wife and family to support. An error in the eyes of the foreigners may bring him to ruin. How can he not depend upon them? We all know that a sudden change in the education of a child or of a society is a very serious matter. It is the beginning which is the most important of all, for on it all the later stages ought to be built. A break, even a little change, upsets the whole course of the education. But here is a break of the most fundamental character. An education in dependence is to be transformed into an education in independence. No change could be more radical. And how that change is to be made, Bishop King does not tell us. The simplest way, perhaps, the only safe way, would be to go back to the beginning and start all over again. That is not the only change. Here Bishop King perceives that it will not do to train only one or two, or a few individuals. A whole class must be created. Why? Why, because isolated self-dependence is dangerous to the church. Men are not naturally isolated, self-dependent individuals. They need the support of their fellows. But that is exactly the principle which was violated in the selection of young catechists to stand alone over a congregation of their elders. He himself said, some of them may give way under the stress of temptation and loneliness. The loneliness of a catechist trained by foreigners in mission schools and sent to take charge of a village congregation, and the dangers of that position, are familiar to all who have any knowledge of the mission field, and indeed to any man possessed of the smallest imagination. But if the catechist is lonely and isolated in the village, the native priest is not less isolated and lonely in his parish. At the very top of the tree, the episcopate, the bishop sees the danger, but he ought properly to go back once more to the very beginning and see that it is an error to put a youth in an isolated position as a catechist, with no support except that of his foreign master. When Bishop King speaks of the importance of making the idea of native episcopate familiar to a clergy and laity, since that idea is, in his view, the idea of a head governor over a great number of clergy, of an official who is chief even of the foreign missionaries, he is treading on very dangerous ground. For if he is right in saying that the European missionaries can hardly submit to such a rule, and if it is true that the mission has so managed its business that they can with difficulty withdraw, then to make such an idea familiar to a native clergy and laity who are beginning to feel their powers for self-government growing must create grave difficulties. That way lies strife for the supremacy. It is hardly to be expected that the native clergy and the bishop and the missionaries will all agree exactly as to the moment when the day of independence has dawned. Missionaries and officials of missionary societies and bishops are always talking of the day of independence, but it is generally as far off or as in some years to come, someday, but never today. Natives educated in colleges generally think that it should come earlier than the missionaries think good, and then the struggle begins in earnest. That such a struggle is the inevitable consequence of the training which we have been discussing is quite certain. Already in many of our missions, signs of its advent are appearing, and they would be still more apparent if it were not that the native Christians largely depend upon the pecuniary support of the missions and fear to sacrifice it. Lord Morley, referring to the government of our colonies, has told us that Mr. Gladstone was never weary of protesting against the fallacy of what is called preparing these new communities for freedom, teaching a colony like an infant by slow degrees to walk, first putting it into long clothes, then into short clothes. A governing class was raised up for the purpose which the colony ought to fulfill itself. Whilst waiting for the grant of free institutions, they are condemned to hear all the miserable jargon about fitting them for the privileges thus conferred, while, in point of fact, every year and every month during which they are retained under the administration of a despotic government renders them less fit for free institutions. Our error lay, he said, in the attempting to hold the colonies by the mere exercise of power. That is precisely what we are doing in our missions. That is precisely the fallacy which lies at the root of the scheme which Bishop King sets forth. I have dealt thus at length with Bishop King's article, because it is the best expression that I can find of the theory most commonly held amongst us. In this theory, the consecration of a bishop is the crown and final attainment of the true church of the country. We invert the biblical order at every point. Baptism is made the crown and final attainment of an attempt by a hearer to learn the doctrine and to keep the law, instead of the beginning of a new life. The priesthood is made the final attainment of a church which has grown sufficiently in wealth to be able to support an official, paid according to a scale which we think befitting his dignity, instead of a necessary and essential part of the constitution of a church. The church of the country is composed of a large number of groups of Christians, instead of a large number of churches. The bishop is the last step in a long and weary path by which a church is created out of churchless, priestless, and non-sacramental congregations. It is not surprising that disasters should befall a church so organized. To take an instance at random, the Kakaris were the original inhabitants of Assam. The Reverend S. Endel, who labored 40 years in Assam, opened up missionary work among them, and about 1,000 were brought into the kingdom. Churches and schools were built, and there was every prospect of a mass movement. Since Mr. Endel died about 13 years ago, there's been no one who had known the Kakari language. The Christians have dwindled to 400. They are visited as often as possible, but have to be ministered to in the Assami language, which they very imperfectly understand. Or this: the bulk of the Christians in Banting, in the Diocese of Sarawak, have lapsed back into heathenism, and the bishop who writes of it asks, "Why is it?" and answers the question by saying that, in the old days of 20 or 30 years ago, there was always a European priest in charge of the station, which was considered to be a stronghold of Christian aggressive work. But since these workers moved on elsewhere, we have been unable to replace them by resident European workers, and the inevitable has occurred. There are plenty of resident Menangs, or Dayak, witch doctors in the village, and the people have gradually come under their sway, and the result is obvious. Such stories, they are not infrequent, are always used as an appeal for more missionaries. But in truth, these disasters are the result not of the absence of white missionaries, but of the misuse of them as pastors and leaders of the native congregations. In the first instance, which I quoted, these Kakris should not have been dependent on one foreign missionary, who knew their language, for the simple ordinances which Christ ordained for all his disciples. And the small remnant which survived should not have received its spiritual sustenance in a language which it did not understand. In the second instance, the heathen had ministers of their own, while the Christians, on the withdrawal of the white missionary, had none. A Christian native bishop or priest ministering the sacraments to his people would have been the equal of any Menang. Deprived of all sacraments without any Christian ministry or organization, they fell. Is it surprising that when Christians are deprived of the means of grace, they should fall? Christ did not ordain the sacraments as luxuries, but as the necessary means of grace. When we deprive his people of his grace in order to maintain a type of ministry trained and paid in our peculiarly Western way, we cannot be surprised if disaster befalls us and our converts. Yet there are men who would say that the risk of a moral failure such as that of the church at Corinth outweighs the lapse of whole congregations from the Christian faith. I said in my second chapter that the spontaneous expansion of the church involved not merely the multiplication of Christians, but the multiplication of churches. The spontaneous growth of the early church depended not only upon the freedom with which its members did their duty and preached Christ wherever they went. It depended not less upon the freedom with which churches, real churches, with presbyter bishops or bishops and priests, were established, than any church could, and did, provide for any new group of converts by giving them an organization like its own. Such expansion is impossible on the theory which we have been considering. It is impossible to imagine the spontaneous activity of an individual resulting in the creation of a new church. It can only result in the creation of a new congregation dependent upon the few priests in the country, and adding to their already overwhelming burden. The church in the country cannot create a new church like itself. It must wait until sufficient money has been subscribed to endow a new bishopric. It is perfectly clear, then, that a theory such as we have been considering hinders to an incalculable extent, even if it does not absolutely prevent any spontaneous expansion. But the moment that we think of churches in the apostolic sense of the word, we see at once that the spontaneous activity of the individual members might speedily result in the multiplication of such churches all over the country. There's another story. Father Herbert Kelly, in 2 articles in the East and West from which I have already quoted, set it forth. He proclaimed that we ought to return to the primitive system, exactly that system which Bishop King called a perilous shortcut, to be avoided at all costs. Let us imagine ourselves, says Father Kelly, in some small primitive church, met to choose a pastor. Our course is quite obvious. Normally, we want an experienced, a middle-aged Christian of strong character and independent position, who is not, and need not be, afraid to speak to us, a man zealous for his faith, and who understands it, learned in the Scriptures. We have no college-trained men among us, but at 40 a man has learnt from life. We are not trying young experiments. We want someone to lead us and help us such as we are, and we all know one another's mind and capacities much better than a board of examiners will ever do. Thus, the ministry was provided, but how was it provided for? We know that the early church did not pay personal salaries, since the habit of doing so was made a charge against the Montanists. If the pastor is sent, the sender will be responsible. If, however, the village chooses one of its own members, no difficulty arises. He is sure to be a middle-aged man. He is already providing for himself and is in a position to go on doing so, no doubt with some assistance of gifts and money, kind or labor to compensate for any loss of time through his pastoral labors. The village farmer priest is the father of a family. Of course, being a priest, he is a priest in the Catholic Church. But this does not mean that he is free to accept a call wherever sufficient inducement offers. He is ordained to his own people. I have dealt with the country ministry first, because the simplest condition brings up what is most fundamental. That the country ministry is to us the most difficult problem seems to show that we have somehow missed the fundamentals. The church cannot exist without a ministry, but the ministry exists for the church. That is a sufficient ministry which supplies what the church really needs at the time. When the needs of the church become more complex, the ministry will naturally be elaborated to meet them. Even in towns in the early stages and in small towns for a long time, a local ministry on the village plan will suffice. In the cities, quite at the beginning, the system was the same as in the country, but the difference of circumstances produced a rapid development. The growing mass of church business gave rise to the minor orders of readers, acolytes, etc., and thus provided an opening for young men who might like to devote their life to the clerical profession. In the towns, the bishop was normally, though not necessarily, chosen from the professional clergy. This professionalism was not regarded as fundamental. It grew up where it was wanted, and the business which called it into being provided the means for its support. Father Kelly differs from Bishop King in his estimate of the value of traditional training. He desires to see ordained the experienced middle-aged Christian of strong character and independent position. He realizes that among the first converts there are many such men, the depositaries of the immemorial wisdom of past generations. In every village, in every town, there are such men, the natural leaders of their people. It is such men as these that he suggests should be the leaders of the infant church. Its first priests and bishops. Bishop King, on the other hand, takes no account whatever of this traditional training. Father Kelly differs from Bishop King in insisting that the church must begin with the appointments of priests and bishops. He says that the church cannot exist without a ministry. He talks of the appointment of lay readers as an absurd fallacy. He speaks of the familiar absurdity of the lay reader. Bishop King, on the other hand, makes the familiar absurdity the foundation of his whole scheme of preparation for a native episcopate, and calls congregations ministered to by young catechists churches. Father Kelly differs from Bishop King in his estimate of the value of pay. Bishop King holds that it is gravely open to doubt if the clergy of any church can as a whole be trusted to put forth their best effort if their success or non-success in no way affects their income. Father Kelly says that a pecuniary interest in Christianity is not in itself a good, but a temptation. He differs also from Bishop King in his estimate of clerical training. Bishop King's whole system is based upon an intellectual training. Father Kelly says, college training constitutes a very serious danger. All professional training runs a risk of becoming too technical and abstract. Theological education is at the present more deeply involved in this evil than any other, and in nothing is the mischief so great. I have heard catechists address heathen villagers for an hour on the history of religious development. The ignorance of the village farmer priest is no danger at all. The ignorance which is a danger is the pseudo-knowledge of a half-trained, or still more, of a very highly trained professional agent, drawn to justify his everlasting sermons by the originality of patent Christianities picked up goodness knows where. And curiously enough, Bishop King, for all his emphasis on the training of the professional agent, closes his paper with a warning which should have been in place in Father Kelly's article. We must take care, he says, that our trained men do not lose in simplicity and directness of character what they gain in intellectual development. A missionary in South Africa wrote somewhat as follows: I am staying with C, an untrained catechist of the old sort. He seems to get hold of the people in his own simple way. Such men seem to me better evangelists than the trained men from our colleges. That warning is sorely needed, for this comparison between the trained and the untrained catechist comes to us from many quarters. But nothing is more futile, though nothing is more common, than to imagine that we can avoid a danger by saying that we must avoid it, when it is inherent in our practice. It is like the action of an habitual drunkard who walks into a public house saying, I must avoid getting drunk. So we say that we must avoid the danger of nursing our converts while we are busy arranging everything for them. So we say we must secure for our native priests full opportunities for learning independence whilst we pay them. And so here this evil is not to be amended by saying that the college authorities must take care to avoid it. Its roots lie in the fact that we have despised and set at naught the natural training of experience and have put in its place an artificial and intellectual training before the great body of the people is ready for it. And the inevitable consequence is that those who receive it are separated as by a great gulf from their people. It starts here. Father Kelly well says that the idea of a strictly local ministry, unprofessional, untrained, and unpaid, seems to us inconceivable, though we are very conscious of our own difficulties. But he pleads that it is an error of judgment to assume that because we have now reached an exclusively professional system, therefore a professional system, with all its entanglements, ought to be forced on a quite new church. Objection is sometimes made to the consecration of native bishops on the ground that Bishop Crowther's episcopate was not an unqualified success. But we must not forget that the native episcopacy which Father Kelly proposes is not the episcopacy of which Bishop Crowther was a victim. Bishop Crowther was a native thrust into an impossible position. He was expected to take the place and do the work of a European bishop of the type with which we are familiar, He was the only bishop in a very large area set to direct and govern a large number of clergy and lay ministers who were not ready for a native bishop standing in an English bishop's shoes. There was no African church in any real sense of the word. He was really an agent of the church, missionary society, and episcopal orders. He was dependent upon the society. As Bishop Melville Jones has said, the Niger mission under his, Bishop Crowther's, regime was not a truly African church. It was largely the accident of the deadly nature of the climate which led to the whole of the mission staff being of the Negro race, and that was the only sense in which it was African. It was supported almost entirely by English contributions. There was little or no church organization which could lead to a system of self-government. Under such circumstances, what wonder is it that men found in this episcopate cause for harsh criticisms? But that is not the sort of native episcopacy which St. Paul established, or Father Kelly advocates. No objection to an apostolic practice can be found on an instance which did not even remotely resemble the apostolic example. It is interesting to observe that in matters such as we have been discussing in this chapter, our adversaries sometimes see more clearly than we do ourselves. We are told, for instance, that in Madagascar, the formation of a native church and the growth of a native ministry is the one thing which France, as represented by her present administrators, most fears and dislikes. They repudiate any intention of hindering the work of alien missionaries. Such persons are evidently regarded as necessary evils in an imperfect world. It would seem that they believe that the aliens' work will produce results destined soon to pass away. These French administrators see that a church which depends upon alien bishops and priests must necessarily be weak, and that they can deal comparatively easily with European governors. They see also that the church cannot possibly extend widely or rapidly, or become a power among the natives, so long as the foreigners remain in authority. On the other hand, they see that a native church fully organized and equipped with bishops and priests would at once assume a more permanent and dangerous character. The church would have its roots in the island. It could grow and expand. It would be extremely difficult for them to uproot it. It appears doubtful whether they could ever check its advance by any regulations which they could make. Since the one thing which they dread is the revolutionary power of Christ's gospel, they naturally look upon our hesitation and caution in ordaining native priests and our refusal to consecrate native bishops with approval. They see that the ordination of native priests, and still more the consecration of native bishops, and the establishment of native churches in the apostolic sense of the word, would at once open wide the door for spontaneous expansion. And it is spontaneous expansion that they fear, and rightly fear, if they do not wish to see the church established throughout the length and breadth of Madagascar. Now when our enemies see, and tell us that they see, that a certain course of action would inevitably lead to a result which they dread but we earnestly desire, when they congratulate themselves upon the fact that we do not take it, we surely might well learn the lesson which they teach. The spontaneous expansion of the church is impossible, or at any rate, is severely checked by our refusal to recognize that the apostles knew how to organize the church so that it could expand spontaneously and rapidly, and we are simply defeating our own ends and rejoicing the hearts of our enemies by refusing to recognize it. So I'm not going to spend too long in this chapter. The main theme still holds, right, throughout everything. There are just a few items I want to pick out here. So the main theme, just to kind of recap it, is Alan is trying to figure out, like, what is the apostolic model for what the church is supposed to be? Like what is the church supposed to be? How is it supposed to function? And so largely it's, number one, dependent on the Holy Spirit, which Alan continuously tries to say, hey, look, the modern church is not depending on the Holy Spirit. We're depending on power, right? So like colonialism, depending on power of state, power of money, power of control and structure, institution, like all of these powers we're relying on. We're not relying on the Holy Spirit. And in large part because of that, but also aside from that, the things that we're doing and the way that we're structuring missionary activity and the church in general is that we are not growing spontaneously and rapidly, which is what the early church did. And they did that because things were very organic and they trusted the Holy Spirit. They didn't do things like, he gives examples of like they'll convert people, and then the bishops or whoever like move on and don't really have contact with them, and they're like, well, you don't have anybody ordained over you, so you can't have the sacraments, you can't take communion, do baptism, that sort of thing. And like baptism and communion and all that stuff aren't seen as necessary. They're seen as like, oh, well, once we get enough money, once we're here long enough, then maybe we can get a bishop, and then maybe we can have the sacraments. And Alan's like, that's not the way the church works. Like, you're seeing the sacraments as not a need, but you're seeing them as a convenience, as like something that's a nice accoutrement to the church, right? Something extra. And Alan's like, it's what the church is. How do you have church without communion and baptism? Like, they're first things. They're graces that God gives to us. And he's like, this is messed up. Make bishops. Oh, well, but if we do that, then they're not going to be as well trained. And okay, then rely on the Holy Spirit. But like, let natives be leaders, and like get your ego out of this, right? Trust the Holy Spirit and stop trying to control things. My gosh. And this is something that fires me up too, because, well, like I totally understand the leaning that direction, because I have long felt the way of like, well, you need to go to seminary, and you need this, and you need to have this knowledge and this knowledge and this knowledge. And Alan's like, that's messed up. Like that's not what the church, it's not bad to have knowledge, but also, didn't Paul say knowledge puffs up? And what are we doing? In our rationalistic culture, our Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment culture that Alan was also in, we focus on the intellect. And so Alan talks about how the goal of a lot of people in his day, and I can tell you firsthand experience, still our goal today. I told you of this ministry when we were over in Romania, where we were trying to work with Roma people. And this ministry we contacted to see, hey, how can we get involved? Like, how can we support you in our work? And they're like, well, we don't work with adults. We only work with kids. And they're like, really, once after 14, there's no hope for them. So we just work with like the really young kids. They essentially like did business models of, well, who can we statistically reach out to? Who can we manipulate, influence, whatever you want to call it, right? There's that whole, well, we'll get into that next season. I'm finished recording the next season. We'll talk about free will and all that stuff and manipulation. But right, they've essentially identified there's no hope, because the only hope for people is like my ability to manipulate their emotions and intellect based on their experiences and such. And so adults have no chance statistically. So therefore, we're just going to focus on kids. Now, I'm not saying that ministries which just focus on kids are necessarily bad, but what's the reason you're focusing on them? If you're focusing on them because you think that that's the only hope you have for success, and success being measured by the number of converts, then that's messed up. Like, that's objectifying the people that you're ministering to, and it's not really ministering to them. It's padding your stats and padding them through artificial means by trying to convert through manipulation or whatever you want to call it. My wife had an experience when we met. I was teaching at an international, pretty much a missionary kids school in Mexico City, and she had come over through a mission board, and she was doing missions work at the time. And so one of the things that appalled her that we talked about later, that it didn't really appall her at the time, but like in retrospect, after we kind of had more theological grounding, it's like, oh, that was so disgusting. But they would go door to door and try to essentially convert people. And this one house she came to, there was like a 10-year-old kid that answered the door, and their parents weren't home. And so they led them through whatever, the Romans Road or whatever it was, and asked the kid if they wanted to accept Jesus into their heart. And they said, yes. So, they're essentially there. They mark that person down as converted. And you've got all these types of conversions that it's not the Great Commission. It's not discipling. It's making cheap converts, not saying that person couldn't legitimately have chosen to follow Jesus and couldn't be following Jesus today. but is making cheap converts, not disciples. It's padding stats. It's not the church. And so Alan talks about, a lot of this stuff going on, how people are training. They identify youth instead of identifying elders in the church, right? Who wouldn't be as malleable. They identify and train the youth. And we still do this today. You have somebody young and vibrant coming up, and we identify them as somebody with promise and somebody that we want to train to fill our shoes, as opposed to recognizing, longevity and wisdom and experience of people who are more elder. And so Alan just goes into a lot of like how this throws off traditions, how it doesn't, especially in a foreign culture, it doesn't contribute to effectiveness in a foreign culture, how it isolates the youth. And I mean, even the Bible, I can't think of the reference at the moment, but talks about how putting people who are new in their faith forward into leadership too quickly is a dangerous sort of thing. And I would imagine that something similar applies, because obviously if you're going into a new culture, the elder and the younger could both be very new in their faith. But I imagine that the older person, even if you have an older and younger person equally new in the faith, I would imagine that the older person has a little bit more ability in general, statistically speaking, to be grounded, right? There's just something that cultures through all ages have recognized about elders being different than youth. But a lot of times the goal is to mold the youth because they're, as Alan identified, they're our tools, right? We want to wield them to pad our stats. We want to wield them for our power, for our legacy, all those kinds of things, right? We want success. And success oftentimes means numbers. So there's just this not so good thing about the way that the church, a lot of the institutionalization of the church, including in missions, but missions is really just a reflection of the institutionalized church in the West in general. There's just a lot of power plays, colonialism, whatever you want to call it. It manifests itself in a lot of different ways. And even though it gets a little bit deep here with all these people's names and documents and things, the concept is very clear, and I think Alan nails it, drives it home pretty well. One of the last sort of dangers, it kind of struck me towards the end of this chapter. Alan was talking about how you have these half-trained youth who are kind of coming out, and one of the dangers there is kind of this Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Which is you have enough knowledge to think you know a lot more than you do. And so there's kind of a U-shaped curve where I know that I don't know anything about some things, right? I can't think of anything at the moment. I don't know anything about sewing machine repair. I know zero. But there would come a point if you started to learn about it where you'd kind of get enough information where you'd be like, I know a lot, because you know way more than the vast majority of other people. But compared to somebody who's been doing it for 30 years, or compared to an expert, you really are incompetent. And so there's false assurance that a lot of people can get who are trained under these people who model power and control. They get this false impression that because these people being trained, these youth, are more trained than the people around them, the people in their culture, and therefore they're experts. And then through their expertise of the intellect primarily, they therefore try to exert control and power over the people, even though they are actually very inexperienced and very uneducated in theology and such. So whereas if you have somebody, a new believer, who does not have power and control modeled for them as needs, but reliance on the Holy Spirit, who recognizes in humility that they really don't know much and they can't do this without the help of the Spirit, then they will approach leadership in a very, very different way, and a way that probably I know is more indicative of what the church is supposed to be, a community who, I think the qualifications for elders and deacons, I don't think it has theological training as part of that. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm sure learning and knowing things about God are good, but primarily it was characteristics that were the things you were to look for in electing, in promoting elders and deacons and such. So Alan has done a really good job of identifying a lot of these problems. I don't know. I can't think off the top of my head if he's given a whole lot of solutions at this point, other than stop it and let's rely on the Holy Spirit and let's promote natives and not have these stupid structures. But one thing that he did say here not to do is he said, hey, look, this is like divorce and remarriage. You can't just all of a sudden make laws against it and all of a sudden everybody's heart's going to be fixed. But it's really got to be grounded in Christ and his Spirit. And so I thought, and that analogy came towards the very, very beginning of the chapter. And if you don't remember it, go back and listen to it. And I thought it was really good. But Alan is saying we really need a heart change, and we can't do this by just saying, stop it, don't do it. And we have to recognize this infatuation we have with power and control, and we need a change of heart. And I guess maybe Alan's answer to that would be ask the Holy Spirit to change us, because we need it. So next week will be our last chapter of the spontaneous expansion of the church, and then we will move on to our next season with the problem of evil. So hope to have you back next week.
That's all for now. So peace, and because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it. This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.